Welcome back. This one gets deeper fast, and it's really about seeing yourself honestly. We are getting into stress, relationships, vulnerability, and that weird hunger for outside approval. Wait, the core idea is basically that if you cannot see yourself, everything else gets shaky? Exactly, and that is such a brutal sentence because it sounds simple and then ruins your whole week. It does because everyone wants a technique, but the answer is actually, look at yourself. And people hate that because it is not flashy enough to post. No, the algorithm does not reward self-awareness nearly enough, which is tragic because half the anxiety is just outsourced identity. That line about being seen as a child being tied to survival is intense. Yeah, because then adult criticism does not feel like criticism, it feels like danger. That explains why people melt down over comments that should be minor. Right, and then they think they are weak when they are actually triggered. I think the hard part is admitting how much of our behavior is still childhood business. Bro, that sentence alone should probably end half of adulthood. Imagine how many meetings would be canceled if people had to say that out loud. The stress piece hit me hard because he makes it sound like modern life is just one long, low-grade alarm. And not even dramatic alarm, just constant tiny stress humming underneath everything. That is the scariest kind because you normalize it and call it productivity. Yes, and then you check your breath and realize you have been breathing like a hostage. That is such a wild description, but honestly, accurate. The breath advice sounds almost too basic until you remember basic is usually what saves people. It is almost offensive how simple it is. People want a 12-step framework, and he is like, breathe and stop being attached to nonsense. That is actually the whole industry, destroyed in one sentence. But the attachment point matters, right? Not just deleting social media. Yeah, because he is not saying escape the world, he is saying do not let the world own your mind. Which is impossible for most people because the phone is basically a slot machine now. And we pretend it is just communication. Communication with 40 tabs of emotional damage. The relationship section was huge because he basically says you cannot love properly if you are not okay alone. That sounds obvious, but most people do date like they are applying for rescue. Applying for rescue is crazy, but yes, that is what it looks like. And then they get mad when the other person cannot become their therapist, parent, and soulmate. The relationship job description is absurd at this point. We ask one person to fix our childhood, our loneliness, and our self-esteem. Then we are shocked when the whole thing collapses under that weight. I liked the part about truth being the real foundation, not being right. Because being right is a terrible glue for a marriage. It is the worst glue. It falls apart while you are winning. Winning the argument and losing your life partner, very efficient. The child-rearing part was interesting too, because he keeps pointing to how caregiving shifts. Basically, once kids arrive, the fantasy of constant attention from your partner dies. Which, to be fair, should be obvious, but apparently it is not. He is saying a lot of men panic when they are no longer the center of maternal energy. And instead of growing up, they call it a relationship problem. That is the whole theme of this episode, honestly. People confusing discomfort with injustice. The sex part was also blunt in a useful way. He is basically saying emotional safety comes before sexual openness, which is so unsexy in theory and so true in practice. Truth is sexy, though. That line actually landed. Yeah, because it is one of those lines that is cheesy until it is painfully accurate. And the point about freezing being a fear response changes the whole framing. So people are not broken, they are protected. Exactly, and that is more compassionate than calling everything dysfunction. The vulnerability section might be the most important thing he said. Because vulnerability is not a personality trait, it is just the condition of being alive. Right, you cannot opt out of being woundable. And people spend half their lives trying to look invulnerable, which is exhausting. Meanwhile, trees and crabs are just out there teaching the lesson for free. Nature is such a better life coach than most podcasts. But the deeper point is that growth requires softness, not just strength. That is the part people resist because softness sounds like surrender. It is wild how much of culture is built around avoiding tenderness. Yes, let us all become emotionally armored and mysteriously miserable. That should be on a billboard outside every office. The inner peace part was maybe the cleanest challenge to workaholism. Because people think external success eventually turns into peace. and then they keep chasing the next thing when the peace never arrives. He basically says that temporary validation is not the same as actual wholeness, which is rude because he is right. The best kind of rude, honestly. I liked that he separated stated goals from real intentions. Because people say family, service, and purpose, but their calendar says ego. Calendars are brutal truth tellers. Your time always tells on you. And that idea that growing older should mean becoming more authentic is beautiful. Not shrinking, not hardening, just becoming more yourself. That feels like the whole philosophy in one sentence. The closing answer about the last day on Earth was unexpectedly moving. Just thank you, that was the whole energy. No dramatic manifesto, no performance, just gratitude. Which is probably why it hit so hard. And the final message about suffering being a teacher was a strong way to end it. Not seek suffering, but do not waste it when it comes. That is a very adult sentence, annoyingly so. Painfully adult, yes. I think the series as a whole keeps landing on the same truth. Awareness changes everything. Whether it is stress, love, parenting, or ego, the first move is seeing clearly. And being willing to tell the truth without making yourself a villain. That is the balance, because shame does not heal anybody. Exactly, and that is probably the most useful takeaway for anyone listening. So that wraps our final episode, and honestly, this one has stayed with me. Same here, because it is one of those conversations that keeps echoing after it ends. And now I am just trying not to check my phone for validation for the next hour. Good luck, that is the real final exam. We will see you in this next series, and hopefully with a little more self-awareness. Welcome back. This episode is about self-seeing, chronic stress, and the price of outsourcing your identity. And we are ending the series by asking what actually helps people become less fragmented. The part that got me was how often he came back to not being seen. Yeah, because he is basically saying the wound is not always dramatic, it can be neglect. That almost feels too simple, until you realize how many adults are starving for recognition. And then they call it ambition, which is a very expensive disguise. That is such a brutal line, but it lands. He kept separating being seen from needing to be seen by everybody. That distinction is huge because one is selfhood and the other is addiction. Exactly. And the social media piece makes it feel almost modern mythological. We built machines that constantly ask, do you still exist if nobody taps yes? That is terrifyingly accurate. And his point was not to quit everything, but to stop being owned by it. That is harder than deleting an app because the attachment is internal. Right, you can still use the tool without letting it define your worth. But most people are not using it. They are getting used by it. And that slides straight into the chronic stress conversation. The shallow breathing thing was such a good observation because it is so ordinary. Like you do not notice you are carrying anxiety in your chest all day. Until you sit still for 5 seconds and your body is like, hello, we are not okay. Your body sends a customer support ticket immediately. And the breath part is not mystical. It is almost embarrassingly practical. That is what I liked because he was not selling a fantasy cure. He was basically saying, start by noticing what is happening in you right now. Which is offensive to people who want a 6-step hack. They want a transformation, not a mirror. But then the mirror is the transformation, if you stay with it long enough. He also made stress feel like a social design problem, not just a personal weakness. That is the part people resist because it means your environment matters. It is easier to blame the individual than to admit the system is grinding everybody down. And the system is very committed to not having a reflection. It is deeply allergic to accountability. The relationship section was where it got even more uncomfortable. Because he was basically saying you cannot do intimacy while hiding from yourself. That is annoying because it sounds true. The worst kind of truth is the kind that works. He kept making the point that people want relationships to solve self-abandonment. And then they are shocked when the relationship turns into pressure. Because now the partner is supposed to be a parent, a healer, and a trophy. That is a horrific job description. Unpaid, no benefits, emotionally catastrophic. The idea that emotional intimacy has to come before sexual intimacy was interesting too, especially because he framed sexlessness as a safety issue before a desire issue. That makes a lot of sense, honestly. He was basically saying if the nervous system does not feel safe, the body will not open. Which means people keep arguing about chemistry when the real issue is trust. Yes, and the truth line he said, "That truth is sexy," was so clean. That line should be embroidered on a pillow somewhere. But I do think he is right that safety is doing a lot of invisible work. The masculinity and parenting part was also rough because he was not being cute about it. He was saying some men want the wife to keep mothering them after the baby arrives, which is wild when you say it out loud. But it does explain why so many couples hit a wall after kids. Because the attention economy in the house changes completely, and nobody is prepared for the emotional bookkeeping of that shift. The bigger idea underneath all of it was that growth requires discomfort. Not performative discomfort, but the real kind where your defenses get touched. He kept coming back to vulnerability as the doorway, not the problem. Which is funny because most people treat vulnerability like a software bug. They think they can patch it and move on. But his point was that without vulnerability, there is no growth, period. The tree and crab examples made that feel almost undeniable. Yeah, because suddenly it is not self-help language, it is just nature. And nature does not care about our branding. Nature would absolutely ignore our podcast funnel. Nature would not even subscribe. The ending around inner peace was probably the most important pivot, because he basically challenged the idea that external success can complete you. And that is such a seductive lie for high performers. You win, you achieve, you get the applause, and then you are still hungry. A very glamorous kind of emptiness. He even made the workaholism point feel personal, not preachy, because he admitted he had lived that split too. That is why it hit harder. He was not standing above the mess. He was inside it, describing how easy it is to confuse stated goals with real ones. Like saying your goal is family, while your calendar says ego. That is a devastating audit. And then he lands on inner peace as the hidden goal beneath all the others. Which is almost rude because now the whole list has to be reorganized. The spreadsheet is crying. Because inner peace does not show up on the resume, but it runs everything. I also thought the suffering point was powerful without being sentimental. He was saying pain is not the enemy if you can learn from it. That is a very different posture from trying to numb every hard feeling. And maybe that is the real adult skill, not avoiding pain but metabolizing it. That line about growing older instead of just getting older stuck with me. Because it turns aging into an active practice, not a decline story. Which is actually hopeful if you let it be. And the closing phone call question was such a clean way to land the whole thing. The answer was not dramatic, just gratitude. That felt like the opposite of performance. Which is maybe why it worked. He did not try to sound wise, he sounded clear. And that clarity is what people are actually responding to. Especially people who feel fragmented and are desperate to remember themselves. That final idea, remembering yourself, is almost the thesis of the whole series. Like the work is not becoming somebody new, it is returning. Which is inconvenient for the entire self-improvement industry. They wanted reinvention and got responsibility instead. That is evil but accurate. The best part of this series for me was how it kept narrowing toward the same question. Who are you when nobody is clapping, and are you okay with that person? That is the question that survives after all the noise leaves. And honestly, that is a pretty good place to end. Yeah, this one felt less like a conclusion and more like a dare. A dare to breathe, tell the truth, and stop confusing visibility with value. Brutal but fair. And maybe the quiet win is just being a little more honest this week. That is enough to start with. All right, that is the end of the trilogy, and I actually think we earned the pause. We did not solve humanity, but we did annoy a few bad habits. And if this series made people look inward even once, that matters. Same here, because the point was never perfection. It was seeing clearly. We will be back soon, and hopefully a little less attached to the comments section. No promises, but we can try. Welcome back. This one is about seeing yourself clearly, stress that never quite leaves, and why not knowing yourself gets expensive. And somehow it ends with inner peace, which is annoyingly the whole point. The wild part is he basically says the outside world stops owning you when you actually see yourself. Which sounds simple until your phone, your work, and your ego start heckling you all day. Bro, the ego is the loudest intern in the room. And his point is that a lot of our pain is really old pain getting triggered again. Like being unseen once can make being unseen feel dangerous forever. Exactly, and that is such a brutal sentence if you sit with it. Because then a comment, a silence, or a weird look becomes a whole body event. Suddenly, your nervous system is treating a group chat like a hostage situation. That is actually too accurate. He kept coming back to breath because the body is where the stress shows up first. I liked that he did not make it mystical, just basic awareness and a few conscious breaths. Which is funny because the simplest thing in the world is also the thing nobody does. Because it does not make a good productivity hack thumbnail. But it is real, and he is basically saying chronic stress has become background noise. That part hit me because so many people feel tired without knowing they are tense all day. And then the culture normalizes it, which is the dangerous part. He is not saying every convenience is evil, just that constant stimulation has a cost. Your phone is not your therapist, even though it tries hard to be. It really does try to be everything. The relationship piece was interesting because he does not romanticize love at all. He basically says partnership does not save you from your wounds. It reveals them. Which is rude, but also true. People want relationships to feel like an emotional renovation project. Like, please arrive fully healed and also make me dinner. And he says that is backwards, because you need some capacity to be alone first. Not lonely, just alone enough to meet yourself without panicking. That distinction matters a lot, honestly. It does, because if you cannot sit with yourself, you start using other people as anesthesia. And that is a horrible hobby. Terrible hobby, 0 stars. The marriage part was sharper than I expected, especially the truth over being right thing. That line felt like the whole adult relationship thesis in one breath. If both people want victory, the relationship becomes a courtroom. And nobody looks good in a marriage courtroom. He also said a lot of couples stop growing at the same emotional level. And if one grows and the other refuses, something has to break. That is tragic, but also kind of inevitable. I think what makes it hard is that growth changes what you can tolerate. And then the old arrangement starts feeling like a cage. Growth really is bad for comfortable delusion. It ruins so many good excuses. The sex conversation was probably the most uncomfortable and honest one. He tied sexual disconnection to emotional distance, which makes sense. If intimacy is missing, sex can become mechanical pretty fast. People keep trying to skip the emotional part and then act shocked. Like skipping instructions and blaming the furniture. The safety piece mattered too because fear kills openness. And he is basically saying the body cannot open when it does not feel safe. Which makes the whole culture of performance around sex seem kind of broken. He kept making that point about distortion, that we glorify the part while ignoring the wound. And when he brought up how trauma and exploitation can get wrapped into desire, that was heavy. Heavy, but important, because it forces honesty instead of fantasy. Then he turned to the bigger social picture, and that got dark fast. More childhood distress, more medication, more anxiety, more division, more conflict. It is hard to argue with the pattern when you see it laid out like that. But he also refused the easy doom posture, which I respect. He said strategically optimistic, tactically pessimistic, which is actually sane. That is just adult hope with a helmet on. And it keeps you from becoming either naive or cynical. The most practical thing he said, though, was about intentions. Because he basically asked what in your life supports your real goals and what wrecks them. But then he went deeper and said the hidden goal is often inner peace. That one stung, because a lot of people do act like outer success will deliver it. And he said it never does, not for long. Fame is a terrible meditation practice. Horrible, actually. What I liked is that he did not shame ambition. He just put it in its place. Like serve others, build a family, do meaningful work, but do not pretend that is inner peace. Inner peace has to be there first or everything gets contaminated. And then he got into suffering as a teacher, which is probably the deepest part. Not forced suffering, just not wasting the suffering that already comes. That is a huge difference. Because pain either hardens you or it wakes you up. And the vulnerability piece connects right there. He argued that growth requires being woundable, which is such a strange and beautiful idea. It is weirdly comforting, too, because it means vulnerability is not weakness. It is the condition for development. So the thing everybody avoids is the thing everybody needs. Pretty much. And that ties into the whole seeing yourself idea. Because if you can see yourself, you do not need constant approval. That is a very expensive lesson for a lot of people. especially in a world where everyone is trying to be seen, but nobody wants to actually look inward. Visibility is cheap now. Self-knowledge is premium. Put that on a billboard and charge me for it. I think the final answer he gave about the last day on Earth was beautiful in a very plain way. Just thank you. Not a speech, not a performance, just gratitude. And that feels earned, because he spent the whole conversation talking about what actually matters. Which brings us to the end of the whole series, and I think the big takeaway is pretty simple. If you want a better life, start by telling the truth about what is happening inside you. And maybe be a little less impressed by your own noise. That is brutal advice, but fair. We are done, but honestly, this one probably keeps working on people after the episode ends. That is the hope, and it has been a good trilogy.